Welcome to Trial Site News Podcast Series. Today we have Lee-Fay Low, Associate Professor in Aging and Health at the University of Sydney. An Australia-led research team reveals that dementia research in Australia precludes the ethnic diversity and cultural diversity of the Australian population. The result of the investigators conclude that those in Australia with culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds receive inequitable dementia care. So, Lee-Fay, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Adrian.
The pleasure is ours. So, Lee-Fay, before we deep dive into the topic at hand, could you tell us a little bit about your background? Where did you grow up?
I'm Australian, Malaysian, Chinese. So I was born in Kuala Lumpur and I went to school there. And then my family migrated to Australia. So I guess that's one of the reasons I'm interested in cultural diversity.
So, how did you get into dementia research and, more specifically, the lack of ethnic and cultural diversity in clinical trials related to dementia?
I've got a undergraduate degree in psychology, and my first job when I finished uni for the first time was as a research assistant in a dementia clinical trials team. So I've always worked, I guess, professionally in dementia research. But I guess as a migrant, I was also interested in experiences of people from non-white backgrounds, because I noticed that, well, firstly, we don't have many non-white people in our clinical trials, but that the experiences of the migrant community with regards to dementia or aging and aged care are a bit different from, I guess, what I would call mainstream experiences.
Gotcha. Now, we find that in the United States there is a similar challenge that those considered underrepresented are not sufficiently participating in clinical research. Do you think that this is a trend across the developed world?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, I think that there's analysis of clinical trials show that minority groups are underrepresented worldwide. I mean, if you think about it, decades ago, clinical trials only involved men. So, those results weren't not always valid for women. And now many clinical trials have large proportions of kind of white Caucasian people in it, which means that we can't be confident, I guess, that the drugs or other interventions will work in the same way for people with different genes or different health risks or different diets or lifestyle.
Right, and including that there's not a lot of folks in leadership as well.
Yeah. So I suppose here in Australia, we're a very multicultural community. And I was quite shocked, I think, when someone said to me, I look up to you because you're one of the few Asian women in dementia research. And I was like, oh, and I went, oh, that's actually true. And I guess my interest comes from being a migrant, and people who aren't migrants might just be slightly less interested in or see the need less for diversity in clinical trials.
So given that drug development is becoming more precise, more focused on the individual, it would seem that we would need more diverse representation in the clinical trial patient community. Is this your observation as well?
Oh yeah, we're definitely seeing a trend towards individualized medicine, precision medicine. And to do that, we need to have a diverse group of people. I mean, if you don't have many of, for example, the old in your sample, you can't really, have enough data to know what to do about an old person. Similarly, if you don't have enough data on someone with different genes or different risk factors, then again, you can't treat those people as well. I mean, one example is that Chinese people have high rates of diabetes, and the BMI recommendations are different for Chinese people. So that's one small thing that you have to take into account if you're looking at kind of risk factors for all kinds of chronic diseases.
Which is crucial, and not just that, but say with clinical trials, if you don't have enough representation, your genetic makeup will be different, which means that the potential adverse effects of medication that go through clinical trials may have negative effects that are unforeseen during the clinical trial.
Yeah. So it could be you might be giving a drug that is more likely to have side effects, or a drug that because of some gene interaction is less likely to work on certain groups of people.
Yes. Now, as you learned about clinical research, when did it become apparent that there were equity challenges?
We know in Australia that people from non-English speaking backgrounds present much later for diagnoses, for the diagnosis of dementia. And we also have data showing that nursing homes don't look after people who don't speak English as well. So, for example, you're much more likely to be given a medication to manage your behavior if you don't speak English well. But we also know that it's you're much less likely to have someone who speaks your native language if you don't speak English. So, which explains why you've got behavior, because no one really understands you and you don't understand what's going on around you. So I guess those were the first observations that kind of worried me. I also know that the meaning of dementia is different in Chinese. So the Chinese word for dementia kind of means crazy, idiotic old person. And the word dementia or Alzheimer's disease in Western culture doesn't have as strong a negative kind of meaning, I suppose. I mean, it still has a negative meaning. So I was really, our first big study, I guess, was looking at dementia beliefs and knowledge in Greek, Italian, Chinese, Australian. So it wasn't even a clinical trial. It was just kind of looking at differences in how people understood dementia.
Why do you think there's such a difference between our cultures of the way that dementia is seen as?
Oh gosh, I mean, our cultures are different in all kinds of ways.
Yes.
Partly it's because of mental illness, I think. So dementia is often seen as a mental illness, and I think here in Australia, anyway, we've come leaps and bounds in terms of the stigma around decreasing stigma around mental illness, and I think also we've managed to raise the exposure and understanding about dementia, but that those changes haven't necessarily filtered through to some of the migrant communities who maybe started off with much stronger stigmatized beliefs.
So on that note then, why do you think diversity has been such a challenge in clinical trial and research so far?
Well, from a researcher, if we put a researcher hat on, when we design a clinical trial, I mean, we're trained, you want to control all the variables except for the group that they're in, intervention and not intervention. So in some ways, it's counterintuitive to recruit for diversity. And then, as a dementia researcher, people with diverse backgrounds, they mess up our neuropsychology tests, because my neuropsychology colleagues, say, how do we interpret the results of cognitive tests of people who don't speak English? Those tests are biased against non-English speakers. It's easy not to include them. They mess up, the data.
Right.
So I guess that's one, from a research perspective, we haven't necessarily got the right tests, especially if language or culture biases those tests in terms of cognition anyway. And, we're not trained to think about representation in clinical trials. As an epidemiologist, because I have an epidemiology background, you do want representation, but in trials you're not necessarily striving for that. And then if I put my participant hat on, the way that we recruit for studies might not encourage people from certain cultures into the studies. And, and people from certain groups might be suspicious of wanting to participate in kind of government studies where you're monitored, that culturally they might be suspicious of people coming to the house and asking them questions, basically.
So we know in the past, underserved and diverse populations have had challenging experiences with clinical trials, as seen in here in America. So how have you overcome this fear?
I mean, we've found that working with community organizations, so with the multicultural organizations we're trying to work with, is the way to build relationships. So I'm Chinese, and it's easy for me to work with the Chinese population, even though my Chinese is actually lousy, but I look Chinese and I understand the culture. So, if I go and speak to the Chinese community, they trust me. So having someone who speaks the same language from that culture definitely helps. I mean, we also try and take a much more collaborative approach. So we don't say, oh, we're the researchers, we're the experts, and you're the subjects. We can't say, look, we need your help, we need your community, and this is we're going to help your community. And we always try and give back to the community in some way. So not just recruit people to be in our study, and then that's it. We try. And so even if we went to interview people or get them to participate in our study, then we might run a community education group on dementia, for example, because that's what they want something back from us. So it's more a partnership.
Which is a great approach because, as you just mentioned, people, especially people that are participating in clinical trials, not every one of them, but a lot of people want to feel like what they're doing matters, that they're giving back not just to the community, but to humanity as a whole. So it sounds like you're touching that. So what steps are being taken to expand clinical trials to be the more diverse group in Australia? What approaches appear to be working and what isn't working so well?
Well, at the moment, I think that, the article would be published as part of the beginning of this conversation. So at the moment, I'm working with ADNET, which is our National Dementia Registry, which is our kind of facilitating clinical trials registry. And we're trying to figure out strategies along the lines, as I mentioned, of working with communities about how we get diversity in registry participants. And I hope that ADNET will have a target for diversity in participants. There's still a lot of work to be done in the neuropsychological test space. As I mentioned before, if your English isn't your first language, then the tests work differently for you. It's biased. And so how do we manage that? I think that's like a research problem to solve. And Step Up, which is another of our kind of volunteer dementia registries, we're also going to talking with them about how we support recruitment of more diverse participants into our research registries. So I don't know what will work yet, but I suppose raising the awareness and getting agreements that we need to work on this is where we're at. That's our first step.
And what would you define as what isn't working well that you would tackle first?
What isn't working well? Well, ignoring it is ignoring it, thinking that people, will be diverse isn't working well. I mean, some of the exclusion criteria. So, sometimes we see studies which have an exclusion criteria that if you're not born in Australia, you can't participate. Well, we could get rid of that. Then the question of, does the person need to be able to speak English to participate? How could we, especially if we're not doing neuropsychological testing, do we have to, if we're getting brain scans, do they need to speak English for us to do that, and test a drug or test exercise? How can we be more exclusive? So I think we come from a certain tradition of how trials are run. We need to be more creative about that if we do want more diverse participant groups.
I agree. So the researchers noted that Australian dementia research was in fact contributing to international gains in early detection and lifestyle-related risk reductions. Can you tell us some successes you've had in your research in this area?
Gosh, I don't think I can take personal credit for it. I think that it's really been the dementia research community has come forward so much. 20 years ago, we didn't think that dementia prevention or risk reduction was possible. Now we've had one published trial, the FINGER study, showing that lifestyle modifications can reduce your risk of dementia. And there are multiple big studies, including a big one here in Australia, Maintain Your Brain, which is a dementia prevention study. And we're waiting for those results. But, all the evidence is suggesting that dementia prevention through lifestyle is possible, which is, I think, really, really exciting. I mean, Australia had even before there was heaps of, strong randomized trial evidence, Australia had the first public health campaign to reduce people's risk of dementia. So, Australia's always been one of the leaders, I guess, in being interested in working in this space in terms of prevention of dementia.
Which is a good place to be. So do you have a vision then for how a study should be designed and implemented moving forward that you would like to share?
Gosh, that's a hard question. I don't think that every clinical trial must have, a certain proportion of diversity that's representative of the population. I'm kind of pragmatic enough to realize that that's not possible. I think that in any study that I do now, I consider cultural and language diversity, and then based on the budget and the study aim, we think about how we try to get as diverse a sample as possible, without breaking the bank and without jeopardizing the quality of the science that we're doing. So I know that's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but I can't say, look, I think that 30% of people in Australia are from, culturally diverse backgrounds. So 30% of trial participants should be that, should be from those backgrounds. Because I don't think that that's really going to happen just by setting those benchmarks. I think we've got to be pragmatic about how we design studies so that we are more inclusive of people from, different backgrounds.
Right, well that makes perfect sense. So on a final note then, any parting comments for our audience?
Well, I hope that clinical trialists just think about diversity of their sample. At the very least, please report some data for us on country of birth and maybe ethnicity and language spoken. So at least, because when we were trying to review this data, I mean, in many studies, people didn't even report this data. So even if you don't want to specifically try and recruit a diverse population, so I think ethically you should be thinking about this. At least report these data for in your paper so that we know how biased or non-representative your sample is.
I agree. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today, Dr. Low. We really, really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you for shining a light on this issue. I think it's really important.